Staffordshire, epicentre of the British pottery industry, lesser known is its involvement in World War II. This is where the Spitfire was born. Designed in 1934 by R.J. Mitchell, the Spitfire became one of the most iconic pieces of British history and really helped put Staffordshire and Stoke on the map. We will follow this amazing aircraft's journey from design to production. This is the story of the Spitfire. R.J. Mitchell was born on the 20th of May 1885. He grew up in Kidsgrove, Staffordshire, and was the eldest of 3 sons. He was schooled in Longton and Hanley, part of the Stoke-on-Trent district. It was around this time in high school Mitchell began to show an interest in aviation, designing and flying model aeroplanes. At the age of 22, a young and aspiring engineer began an apprenticeship at the Supermarine Aviation Works in Southampton.
Well, Reginald Mitchell went down to join Supermarine, Southampton, and quickly became their head of design in his 20s and a director of the company.
Obviously, from a very young age, him and his brother were absolutely obsessed with airplanes, made airplane models and everything. And he became an apprentice and started working for Supermarine in Southampton. And became their kind of chief engineer very, very quickly in his life.
This was the beginning of a promising career. In 1919, Mitchell was chief designer at Supermarine. In 1920, however, he was promoted to chief engineer. One of the biggest projects he worked on in this role was a seaplane to compete for the 1931 Schneider Trophy.
And of course it was his plane that won the Schneider Trophy for the country. That was a trophy that had been competed for since 1913, and he had to win it 3 years in a row, and the first winner and only winner was Great Britain in 1931 with a wonderful machine by R.J. Mitchell.
His design of the Supermarine S6B would be something he would later use as inspiration for his most iconic project, the Spitfire. Meanwhile, tensions in Europe were beginning to escalate. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany in 1933 and began to show signs of aggression towards other European nations. In May 1936, as a retaliation to the new treaty between France and the USSR, Hitler marched German soldiers into the Rhineland and just 2 months later provided powerful air and armoured units to the fascist leader Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War. There were fears of another European conflict looming. In the mid-1930s, the RAF's frontline fighters were still biplanes, designed and manufactured during the First World War. They needed updating, fast. The Air Ministry issued a £10,000 contract to Supermarine for the manufacture of R.J. Mitchell's F730 design during the winter of 1934. Within the space of 1.5 years, the first prototype took off on its maiden flight. Taking off from Eastleigh Aerodrome, the 8-minute flight was deemed a success, but it also proved to the engineers that there was still much to improve on. Changes were made over the next few months to improve on the design. A new shaped wooden propeller was added to improve the speed of the aircraft. And changes to the rudder were made to make the aircraft more reliable.
Yeah, he wanted, when he was developing the plane, wanted to call it his new plane the Shrew, and that was on the early plans. But the company director had a daughter and he called her a Spitfire. There was a very famous actress at the time called the Mexican Spitfire. A Spitfire was somebody who was feisty. The Spitfire was argumentative, and he got a hot-blooded daughter, and he used to call her the real Spitfire.
Mitchell was later quoted saying, "Spitfire was just the sort of bloody silly name they would choose." However, in 1936, R.J. Mitchell was diagnosed with cancer for the second time. He consequently gave up his work at Supermarine, but never gave up his passion for the design. He was regularly seen attending test flights for the prototype. His passion never wavered. He loved his creation, but on the 11th of June 1937, he passed away at the age of 42. The aviation industry grieved, but his legacy would live on through the remarkable aircraft he designed. On the 3rd of June 1936, the Royal Air Force ordered 310 Spitfires to be manufactured by Supermarine. By 1938, the demand for Spitfires was so great that the Supermarine factory in Woolston could no longer handle production on its own. The Air Ministry purchased a plot of land opposite the Castle Bromwich Aerodrome to house a new factory. This new production facility was to be managed by the Nuffield organisation, led by Lord Nuffield, also known as William Morris. The primary function of this newly built facility was to assist Supermarine in its production of Spitfires. In 1940, following the resignation of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, Winston Churchill put Lord Beaverbrook in charge of the Air Ministry. Up until May 1940, not a single Spitfire had been produced at the Castle Bromwich facility. One of Beaverbrook's first acts was to rectify this and improve the effectiveness of the factory. One of the first of a new batch was P7593, a Mark IIA Spitfire. On Sunday the 17th of November 1940, Flight Sergeant James Beaumont White, one of the RAF reserves, was tasked with flying the new plane from RAF Kirkbride, where it had been fitted with 303 Browning machine guns, to RAF Westmoreling, where it would be stationed. During the flight, however, visibility worsened as a thick fog came over him whilst flying over the Staffordshire moorlands. What happened next is unclear. Witnesses described that White would fly low over the moorlands for the next 40 minutes. A possible explanation, as given in the crash reports, was that he was trying to locate his position. Suddenly, disaster struck. Flight Sergeant White clipped his starboard wing on a series of rocks, known locally as the Winking Man. His plane was forced into a nosedive from which he would not recover. He crashed into a field at Windygates Farm. The aircraft blew up on impact. Flight Sergeant James Beaumont White was killed instantly, one day before his 21st birthday. In 1978, the Derby Historical Aviation Society conducted an archaeological dig at the site of the crash. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 12 engine was recovered, as well as several other parts. Today, these items can be seen at Thorpe Camp in Lincolnshire. The engine has been cosmetically restored, but the extent of the damage is still clear to this day. It is clear then that the Spitfire always had room for improvement. In fact, by the end of the war, they had gone up to Mark 22.
There were all sorts of issues because of the complexity of some of the wiring, some of the interaction and so on. And that's why it went through so many marks. It was constantly, because it was needed, it was constantly improved. Anything you found that was an error was improved upon. This particular one has clipped wings. They were trying for a while that it doesn't have the final tip of the wing on it. It's clipped, and that was another thing they tried. So they were constantly trying, constantly improve. They wouldn't cling on to something that had caused a problem. If there's a problem, get rid of it, get rid of it, get rid of it, better, better, better.
The Mark I is, until about Mark V, it took us a while to get the design perfect. By the Mark V, things were really starting to look good. So the Mark V was, generally speaking, the beginning of the Battle of Britain. That's kind of what stage you're in. But they were constantly churning out new versions of the Spitfire. They changed little things. Sort of by about the Mark 19, that's the kind of point at which they sort of peaked, I think. The engines kept getting bigger and they kept getting faster because at the same time Germany were working on jets, which we were kind of a little bit behind in terms of where we were in aircraft development. But yeah, the reason there's so many Marks is just because they kept churning them out and improving them a little bit each time. And the Mark IIA, obviously very, very early Spitfire variant, you'd be looking at a high back. The kind of bubble canopy technology wasn't quite there yet. I think it was a kind of quickness and necessity thing, and they had to get them out quickly because obviously the war was approaching. And the Mark I and Mark IIs were obviously needed very, very quickly.
The Spitfire is a plane that solidified its place in history. Its effectiveness in combat is legendary, and the legacy of Mitchell's creation is its role in the Second World War.
When he died in 1937, the Spitfire had only flown the year before, the very first one, and it had only just got its first orders. So he wasn't famous for the Spitfire in his own time. This became his claim to fame during the war, the most successful fighter plane, and its speed. So you've got everything. Its firepower was good with its machine guns or cannons. You've got alternatives, and it was, some of the pilots called it something like a jeweled rapier. It was beautiful, but it was the most deadly, and it could outmaneuver all other aircraft. That's the point.
The Spitfire is iconic because it's known as the aircraft that saved Britain, essentially. It's got such a beautiful design. Everything about it is not only is it the best kind of example of a frontline single-seater fighter plane, but also it's gorgeous to look at. The wing profile is particularly specific to this aircraft, and it's just gorgeous. It's a gorgeous plane.
Today, preservation efforts to keep the legacy of the Spitfire are ongoing in its birthplace of Stoke-on-Trent. In 1972, RW388, a Mark 16 Spitfire, also built at the Castle Bromwich factory, was gifted to the city of Stoke-on-Trent. It would spend several years on static display under a glass canopy before being moved into the interior of the Potteries Museum in 1986, where it remains to this day.
Well, this plane was started action at the start of 1945, late in the war, so it only saw the latter part of the war. It then went on to a further war, the Korean War. You know, it was used further.
It was gifted to Stoke-on-Trent, actually gifted to the people of Stoke-on-Trent by the RAF. They kind of did this in a lot of places around the country. Most of them became gate guardians at aircraft bases. But ours was gifted to the city itself. RW388 is probably the most original Mark 16 Spitfire in the world. It hasn't kind of been touched for kind of 20 years. So everything on it's original. So when the BBMF were doing a Mark 16 restoration, they asked us if they could come and do a lot of work on it and take measurements and bits and pieces. So it's been really important.
Operation Spitfire is an ongoing project to restore RW388 and continue to tell the story of R.J. Mitchell.
The Operation Spitfire team is a team because we've got the experts, the people that actually engineer Spitfire parts and actually do the work, and that is Supermarine and the people involved there. We have the family, we have two Mitchells on board, we have the great nephew of Reginald Mitchell. That's very important, because when it was delivered here it was nearly 90% complete inside, and everything has to be renovated, parts have to be replaced, remade, to replace parts that have corroded and so on.
Today, Supermarine Aero Engineering are still involved in the legacy and preservation of the Spitfire. They continue to manufacture parts for the current crop of planes, an important task, as they are one of the very few who know the intricacies of the Spitfire.
So this is where we do all of our machining work. We make mostly spare parts for Spitfires. So for example, we'll do anything from pins and screws to more complicated stuff like undercarriage legs and undercarriage rams and stuff like that. I'll show you some of those later. But we mostly use, we've got several different lathes, all different sizes. Everything's handmade, so we haven't got any CNC stuff. CNC is kind of the standard thing for engineering now. We've also got several milling machines where we do kind of more complicated stuff. And yeah, so we make everything on the premises, everything's handmade, and it's all kind of either small production runs of stuff because there aren't many Spitfires around, or we do occasionally sub things out to other contractors to do bits and pieces. So yeah, that's the machine shop basically. We've got some bits on the Spitfire that need to be heat treated. A lot of the kind of aluminium stuff needs to be heat treated, so we've got a big oven that's all calibrated that we do stuff in. It tends to be, most of a Spitfire is made from duralium, which is an aluminium alloy, and that has to be heat treated to a certain temperature to make sure everything kind of stays in its stable state. So this is really where my main focus is. I'm kind of a coppersmith really, so all of the Spitfire pipes, the majority of the Spitfire pipes are made out of copper. We have to hand bend them on these jigs that we made. So what you've got here is the kind of standard pipe set that we do. So this is a Mark 9 and a Mark 5. They're the same pipe set essentially. We do other ones as well. So up here we've got PR19. So they're the photo reconnaissance Spitfires, and they were very, very high speed Spitfires. So they've got a different set of pipes for high altitude, high speed flying. And obviously we make all of those brand new from original patterns and parts we've got. So for example, we've got, these are off the Lancaster actually. We're doing a big job at the moment for the Lancaster bomber for the BBMF. So this is one that came in as a pattern. As you can see, they get a bit of sort of wear and tear. They get scratches and dents and all sorts of things in them. So we have to take the pattern. We'll then make a jig off of the pattern. This one's a heavy one. And then we'll make a brand new version, exactly the same in every single way, but brand new. So at the moment we're working on, it's a big project, it's been going on for six months or so. We're making some spinners for the PR19, so it's the same as that pipe set up there. That's actually one there in our fuselage jig. It's a two-part spinner, so obviously as the Spitfire's got bigger, the PR19's quite a big one. The spinners got bigger themselves, so this is one part of the mould for spinning the aluminium sheet for turning the spinners. Really interesting thing about this jig is it's the most accurate Spitfire fuselage jig that's ever been made. So from one end to the other, it's almost perfectly in line. So when we, obviously it's again with the tooling like I said earlier, when we build tooling we want it to last and we want it to be able to use it over and over again. So as you can see at the minute we've got part of a Spitfire fuselage in here. This is just the cockpit section. So what you're looking at here is frames 5 to 12. Frame 11 here is basically where the pilot's head will go, so if you can kind of visualise that, that's the best way of looking at it. But yeah, this is for a cockpit simulator that we're making for a group called Operation Spitfire, working with the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery, so that's what we're doing on that in a minute. But yeah, the jig itself took us nearly a year and a half to make, to get everything absolutely perfect, and then we built a full fuselage, skinned, painted and everything, and it went off and it's now on a flying aircraft, so that's quite exciting. They're a fascinating aircraft, and the more I work on them, the more kind of I learn to appreciate the engineering behind it.
What started as the Shrew in the mid-1930s went on to become one of the most iconic aircraft of all time. It played a pivotal role in the Second World War for Britain, cemented its legacy and became a symbol of British determination and culture. This will, and forever will be, the story of the Spitfire.